minutes past 12, so I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Vibert and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Volunteering at NCVO, and I'm your chair for today's event. So welcome to the first event of this research project on assessing financial vulnerability and risk in the UK's charities during and beyond the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm going to start just by giving you a little bit of background to the project. So this project is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and earlier this year there was a rapid response call for proposals for projects that will contribute to our understanding of and response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts, and we're very grateful to our funders for funding this piece of work that we're talking about today. So the project is led by the Third Sector Research Centre at Birmingham University, along with the University of Southampton and the University of Stirling. So NCVO is really delighted to be collaborating with this project team. The Third Sector Research Centre and NCVO have worked together for many years on the evidence base on the voluntary sector, including on the construction of qualitative data sets about voluntary organisations. So the aims of this particular project are around providing analysis of the impact on charities of the very severe financial constraints that they will experience due to the immediate and longer term economic effects of the COVID-19 crisis. And it's building on a real wealth of research that we've carried out over the last decade, and the project will look at financial vulnerability across the population of charities in England and Wales and show how it varies according to different organisational characteristics. So I am going to just tell you a little bit about the format of the event before I hand over to our speakers. So we have David Clifford and John Mohan who will present the findings from their study of charity reserves, and that will be then followed by responses from our panellists, Richard Hebditch and Brian Carr, before we open it up to a wider conversation, question and answers and discussion session. So you're really welcome to post questions in the chat function as the speakers are talking. And I think Angela and I are going to monitor the chat when we come to the Q&A after the panellists, and we'll invite you to ask questions. So I'm going to hand over now to John Mohan and David Clifford, who are going to present for about 20 minutes about the work. Over to you.
Welcome to everybody. It's nice to see lots of old friends and colleagues and a fair number of new ones in the list of participants joining the meeting today. And this is, as Sarah said, part of a long-running partnership between ourselves and NCVO. And the core of that has been a shared interest in the evidence base, and that's a particular issue, I think, right now with discussions of the COVID situation, where obviously that there's a great deal so far of concern, but not a huge amount of hard evidence so far. As an indication of that, we've got estimates of the losses of income to charities ranging between 4 billion and 10 billion pounds. Now, they're huge sums by any standards, but that's a range of 2.5 in the estimates. Clearly, we're going to see massive losses through the loss of this year's fundraising season, the loss of various forms of face-to-face income generation and trading income, the reductions in household incomes that have followed from COVID-19. And then that's all taking place against the background of rising needs. So we know that these are going to be very challenging times. What are we going to do about that today in terms of providing evidence base for it? What we want to look at is where charities actually were on the eve of COVID-19. So Sarah mentioned that the project was about evidence during and beyond the COVID pandemic, and we're slightly taking a step back here because we're looking at the, if you like, some aspects of the financial preparedness of charities in terms of their resources, their reserves, and how they relate to their patterns of expenditure. And this is a fairly large-scale piece of work. We're using administrative data from the Charity Commission on over 12,000 charities. But a corollary of that is that it's and it's important to understand this from the start, that the data refers to financial years ending primarily in 2019 and in some cases in 2018, but these are the latest available returns to the Charity Commission that we have available for the period prior to the onset of COVID. Now, why might reserves be important? Well, essentially, in terms of providing financial flexibility to organisations when they're faced with a shock to charitable income. There's an academic literature on this. We cite some references to it. We will make a longer version of the academic of the paper we've drafted available in due course, but there's an academic literature primarily from the USA on financial vulnerability, which will make some fairly obvious points. Charities with low levels of reserves being vulnerable and therefore likely to have to cut back on their activities when they experience a financial shock, whereas those with high reserves more resilient and therefore more able to smooth out imbalances. And the academic literature in this seems to focus on a 3-month cut-off point. To what extent could organisations survive for 3 months based on the reserves they have in place if they had to rely only on that as a source of income? So we're going to use that as a kind of benchmark in the presentation. I know there's a small-scale study came out last week by BDO, I think, which focused in some depth on the accounts of a sample of 48 charities, and I think they were able to go into a little bit more detail than we are with this paper, and I think they arrived at slightly different conclusions. Just to explain what we're doing here, in the returns to the Charity Commission that we're using, reserves are defined as unrestricted funds that are freely available for use in furtherance of an organisation's objectives. So that is going to exclude things like assets that they can't easily sell off without affecting the operation of their activities. It's going to exclude restricted funds that are limited to a very specific purpose. It's going to exclude the endowments. And this is data that's collected only, and it's important to understand this too, for organisations with incomes greater than £500,000 that submit what are known as the Part B returns to the Charity Commission. And we have a total of 12,743 such organisations in the version of the data that we use for our analysis. Now, there are no hard and fast rules about the reserves that charities should maintain, but there is guidance from the Commission which talks about the responsibility of trustees being to make an appropriate assessment of risk depending on the circumstances of their particular charity. And clearly there's a tension between resilience, maintaining a buffer against threats, versus pressures to spend from a, there's a public perception sometimes perhaps that they need to spend on mission related activities. In setting reserves, the Commission talks about how charities should be guided by the best evidence available. That might include their own recent financial history and experience. It might include comparisons with other similar organisations. But it is fair to say that the guidance didn't envisage, and nor does this evidence encompass, the circumstances of a global pandemic or the associated public health measures or the speed of the onset of COVID-19. These were circumstances that are beyond the range that might reasonably be expected by organisations. The sort of existential threat, at least to particular income streams, that and the threat in terms of rising needs that those circumstances encompass. So using that very simple metric, there's a headline figure which we can give. There's a graph about this later on. 43% of organisations in this population of charities have under 3 months of expenditure in reserves. A third of charities have less than 2 months, and there's a fifth which have barely 1 month of expenditure in reserves. Now, of course, those bald figures sound quite scary at first blush, and the assumption that's being made there is that what happens as of the onset of COVID-19 is that organisations had no other funds on which to draw. All other income streams ceased. They would therefore run out of cash immediately and have nothing but the reserves left to fall back on. And clearly the effects are going to vary between organisations because of the income mix of different types of charity. So what we do in the analysis is look at the ways in which the level of reserves varies according to characteristics of organisations, such as their size, the field of charitable activity within which they operate, their age, their main funding stream, and geographical location as well. We look at the ratio of the reserves to headline expenditure, and what we do is we consider the median. That's the 50th percentile of the ratio. In other words, focusing on the typical charity. So what that means is the median, if we rank all our organisations in order of their incomes from £500,000 upwards, if we rank them in terms of this ratio where they've got no reserves at all as opposed to many years of reserves, we will look at the midpoint of that ranking, and it's usually, depending on the characteristics of organisations, between 3 and 6 months. But we also look at some other elements of the distribution with a particular focus on the 10th percentile. That's organisations that are most vulnerable of all. That is to say, the organisations that have got very much the lowest level of reserves. And the box plots will look something like this. So the thick line, the bar, represents the range of observations between the 25th and the 75th. So that's the upper and lower quartiles of the distribution. The thick line is the median, and then the point sticking out at the left-hand end is the 10th percentile. So we're looking that the graphs will usually be of the form where the horizontal axis is the numbers of months in reserve that organisations have. That's what the overall pattern looks like. Given what I've just said, you can see that the left-hand column there is the months. These are months of expenditure in reserve, and the frequency to distribution of those. Around 21% of charities in this data set have a month or less of expenditure in reserve. Another 11 or so percent have 2 months or less. So that gives the figure of 33% that I mentioned earlier. And there's a small number at the top where about 10% where the figure is over 3 years in these unrestricted reserves. So first of all, how does this vary by size? Well, you can see there that the median for these income bands is around 4 months for organisations in the £500,000 to £1 million range, and it decreases a little bit as organisations get larger. The income bands are a fairly arbitrary way of summarising the distribution, and there's very much smaller numbers as you go down that graph. So there's only a very small number of organisations in the £100 million plus bracket. And obviously also the amounts of money that an organisation needs for 3 months reserves are very much larger at that place in the income distribution. So maybe something in that graph is to do with the pressure on particularly very large and very visible organisations not to maintain what looks like enormous mountains of cash in reserve. But generally, you can see a reduction in the median months of expenditure in reserve from around 4 months in the smallest organisations here to just under 3 in the largest ones. We then look at what variations there are by the main income stream. Now, this is looking at the income of organisations in relation to some fields that are specified by the Charity Commission. And some of these are quite generalised, but essentially charitable activities is going to refer to things like income from the sale of goods or contracts for the provision of services. Income from voluntary donations is going to be things like direct gifts from individuals. That might be standing orders, it might be legacies, it might be grants from grant-making trusts. Generating funds is going to be things like associated directly with trading activities to raise money, such as charity shops and the like. And what we see here, and we're looking at the majority in what we're looking at each of these 3 cases, is organisations that get the majority of their income from those broad classes of funding. So the ones at the top there, where they're getting the majority of their income from charitable activities, these are organisations that are going to be largely getting their income from delivering services and receiving fees and in payment for that. And there, the median is just over 3 months of expenditure in reserve, in contrast with organisations where the majority of their income is from voluntary donations, where it's just over 4 months. But as you'll see, perhaps saying something which echoes some broader comparative literature, is it better to have a broader funding base? The organisations with no majority income stream appear to have been in the best position, having typically 5 months of expenditure in reserve. When we look at the age of the organisation, we see we see some differences as well. The main contrast here is between organisations that have been around a long time and organisations that haven't. And again, we might expect this as an organisation becomes more established, develops stronger networks and connections. The likelihood is that it's going to have be able to accumulate an asset base over time. So when we look at organisations that have been on the books, in this case the register, for 50 years or more, typically they've got over 6 months of expenditure in reserve, contrasting with the organisations that have been registered for less than 25 years or 10 years or less, where the position is a little over 3 months in reserve. So there's more suggestion here that organisational resilience is enhanced the older and more established an organisation is, and I guess we think that's intuitively reasonably plausible. We also break this out by different fields of activity. These are broad categories that you will probably recognise from the NCVO Almanac and from the International Classification of Non-Profit Organisations, where at the bottom of the graph we've got a set of organisations with around 6 months of expenditure in reserve, contrasting with more vulnerable organisations at the top, particularly around cultural and recreational activities, international organisations, and the broad category of umbrella bodies, the kind of infrastructure for the sector, employment and training, all of those having less than 3 months of expenditure in reserve. And I suppose looking at some of the the headline coverage about the vulnerability of some arts organisations, that seems to be echoing the issues that have been flagged in some news coverage about the vulnerability of certain venues. It's important to remember, though, that right across the board, if you look at the 10th percentile of the distribution, really regardless of the sector, the subsector that organisations operate in, there's at least 10% of organisations in more or less all fields that have less than a month's expenditure in reserve. So there's a tail of the distribution, if you like, a subset of organisations that are really very vulnerable. And the last graph is slide is where we look at geographical differences. Here, we're only looking at the ones that we can pin unambiguously to one region. In Charity Commission data, there's a field in which organisations can specify whether they operate in only one local authority, two or more, or basically on a national canvas. And so we're looking only at the subset of 3,800 organisations that say they operate in only one local authority. And the range here is from 38 to 48%. It seems to be highest, about 45% in Yorkshire and Humberside, Wales and East Midlands, and a bit lower in Eastern England and the North East. Now, these are differences that are going to be largely attributable to the mix of organisations. As an example of that, certainly in some parts of South East England, where you've got a lot of fairly long established charities, which I've already indicated are organisations that tend to have better, larger levels of reserves, then that will mean that the regional figure comes out a bit lower than it might do in places where there's a large number of organisations have been established fairly recently. And we've got a more complicated regression analysis. If anyone wants to talk further about that for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to pass over that one today. So just to wind up, why isn't my slide letting me move on? Oh yes, sorry, one last substantive slide is about trends. We've got the data for the last 12 or 13 financial years. So there's around 120,000 separate returns from charities in this data set. And we've looked at globally at what's happened to the proportion of organisations. We've flipped the index here. This is the proportion of organisations that do have at least 3 months expenditure in reserve. And it's gone up from around 52% to 57 or so percent, which is obviously 100 minus the figure of 43% that I quoted at the start of the presentation. So reserves were actually improving reasonably steadily. Charities had begun to recover their financial position after the financial crisis of 2008. So there's a lot of variability, which is a function of a number of organizational characteristics. There's a sizable tail of organizations which have negligible reserves, that can survive if they had to for less than a month, or even at best even a few days or a couple of weeks on the reserves they've got, which suggests quite a lot of vulnerability. The precise point at which this is going to become a major challenge is going to depend on a number of other things which will enter the mix, such as the income streams on which organizations can draw, some of which will have been decidedly adversely affected by COVID-19, the complete loss of lots of fundraising events that involve face-to-face contact, for example. But on the other hand, other sources of income may continue if you're an organization where you've got a fairly strong donor and support a base from people whose incomes haven't so far suffered as a result of the COVID crisis. So there's a lot of complexities depending on the mix of organisations. And just to briefly wind up by saying what we're going to do in later parts of the project, we're going to look at trying to cross-reference some of this data with the information on individual charities that goes into the almanac, which breaks income sources into a lot more detail, and which has also been gathered now for around 12 years, I think, slightly more recently than the Part B returns from the Commission. So we want to look at the extent to which things like the reserves position and the vulnerability of organisations is a function of their income mix over time. We want to do other things like look at dissolution rates of organisations. We're getting lots of surveys saying that very large numbers of organisations are going to go out of business. Essentially, what we're going to do there is look at the kind of excess mortality that's happening, much in the ways we talk about this in the context of COVID. Are more organisations closing down than we would expect in a typical year? And we're also going to look at financial trajectories of organisations, which ones experience steady growth, which ones have experienced more disruption, more fluctuations up and down, and how they are going to be affected by COVID-19. So that's a fairly top-level aggregate presentation of some of the most up-to-date statistics that are around currently on reserves. And I think I'll leave it there and hand it over to our two other panelists. Thank you.